The year is 1855, and a 16-year-old boy is walking through the muddy, chaotic streets of Cleveland, Ohio. His shoes are worn, his pockets are nearly empty, and his family is on the brink of ruin, abandoned by a father who is a literal traveling con man. This boy has no safety net, no elite connections, and no reason to believe the world owes him a single thing. Yet in his breast pocket, he carries a small, red paper ledger where he meticulously records every single penny he earns, spends, or gives away. 50 years later, this exact same boy will control 90% of the oil in America, possessing a fortune so immense that it makes modern tech billionaires look like mere storefront hobbyists. His wealth will represent over 2% of the entire United States gross domestic product, a concentration of financial power that has never been matched before or since. He is John Davison Rockefeller, a man whose very name became synonymous with the American dream and the ultimate corporate nightmare. We live in a world fundamentally built by his hands, yet he remains an enigma wrapped in an iron suit. How did a penniless clerk transform a chaotic, lawless frontier industry into the most terrifyingly efficient monopoly in human history? The answer is not found in grand speeches or sudden strokes of luck, but in a cold, calculating obsession with order that bordered on the religious. He was called a savior of industry by some, and an industrial vampire by others. A paradox of a man who gave away hundreds of millions of dollars while ruthlessly destroying anyone who stood in his path. To truly understand the world Rockefeller stepped into, you have to imagine a time of utter darkness and blinding light. In the mid-19th century, humanity was desperately searching for a way to light its homes after sundown because whale oil, the traditional fuel for lamps, was becoming scarce and prohibitively expensive. Then, in the mud of western Pennsylvania, someone hammered a pipe into the earth and struck a black, foul-smelling sludge that burned with a brilliant, steady flame. It was the birth of the American oil boom, a wild, lawless period that closely resembled the California gold rush. Thousands of desperate speculators rushed to the hillsides, throwing up wooden derrick towers, tearing up the earth, and pumping crude oil out of the ground as fast as humanly possible. It was a landscape of pure chaos, defined by sudden fortunes, catastrophic fires, and constant lawlessness. Towns sprang up overnight from the mud and disappeared just as quickly when the wells ran dry. There were no rules, no regulations, and absolutely no stability. One week, a barrel of oil was worth $20, and the next week, so much oil had been pumped that the price collapsed to a mere 10 cents, making the wooden barrel itself worth more than the liquid inside it. Most men looked at this madness and saw a chance to gamble, a lottery where they might strike it rich on a single well. Rockefeller, working quietly as a young merchant in Cleveland, looked at this exact same scene and saw something entirely different. He did not see adventure or glory. He saw an intolerable, wasteful mess that desperately needed a master. He realized that the real power did not belong to the men sweating in the mud to drill the oil, but to the men who could control what happened to that oil once it left the ground. Rockefeller understood a fundamental law of economics that his competitors completely ignored, a principle that we can think of as the bottleneck strategy. Imagine a massive, wild river where thousands of independent streams flow down from the mountains. If you try to build a dam at the source of every single stream, you will spend all your energy and money chasing ghosts. But if you march downstream to the single narrow canyon where all those waters must converge, you can build a single massive gate and control the entire river. For the oil industry, that narrow canyon was the refining process, the act of cooking the volatile crude oil into safe, usable kerosene. Rockefeller did not want to drill for oil because drilling was a gambler's game, full of dry holes and empty promises. Instead, he built a refinery. He founded the Standard Oil Company, a name chosen specifically to reassure a terrified public that his product was safe and would not explode in their living room lamps. From that single base, he began to construct his machine, using a twin strategy he called horizontal and vertical integration. To visualize horizontal integration, imagine a giant vacuum cleaner sucking up every competing refinery on the block. Rockefeller would approach his rivals in Cleveland with a simple, chilling proposition. He would show them his books, prove to them that he could refine oil cheaper than they could, and offer to buy them out for a fair price in cash or Standard Oil stock. If they accepted, they became wealthy partners in his empire. If they refused, he would systematically crush them by selling his own oil at a massive loss until the competitor ran completely out of money and went bankrupt. At the same time, he mastered vertical integration, which meant buying every single piece of the supply chain. Standard Oil did not just refine the product. They bought the forest lands to cut the timber, built their own wooden barrels, manufactured their own chemicals, and owned the warehouse wagons that delivered the fuel. By eliminating every middleman, Rockefeller drove his production costs down to a fraction of what anyone else could manage. But his ultimate weapon, the secret engine of his monopoly, was his relationship with the railroads. Because Standard Oil shipped more freight than anyone else in the world, Rockefeller went to the railroad kings and demanded massive secret discounts called rebates. He went even further, demanding drawbacks, which meant that every time a competitor shipped a barrel of oil, the railroad had to pay a percentage of that rival's shipping fee directly into Rockefeller's pocket. He was turning his competitor's own survival into his personal profit. The machine was flawless, but human beings are not cogs, and a system built on total domination will eventually trigger a massive counter-reaction. By the late 1870s, Standard Oil controlled 90% of the refining capacity in the United States, and the independent oilmen of Pennsylvania were desperate, feeling the noose tightening around their necks. They decided to strike back with a radical, unprecedented engineering project, constructing a massive pipeline over 100 miles long across the Appalachian Mountains to bypass the railroads entirely and break Rockefeller's stranglehold. It was an industrial war. Standard Oil used its immense political influence to block legal permits, bought up strips of land directly in the path of the pipeline, and allegedly deployed gangs of laborers to sabotage the construction sites. Yet, through sheer grit, the independent oilmen succeeded, and the oil began to flow through the mountains. For a brief moment, it looked like the Titan had been outmaneuvered, but Rockefeller merely smiled and used his bottomless reserves of cash to build his own, even larger pipeline network within months, completely neutralizing the threat. The true crisis, however, was not coming from competitors in the mud, but from the changing world and the power of the printed word. A new generation of journalists began to shine a bright light into the dark corners of Standard Oil. A fearless writer named Ida Tarbell, whose own father had been ruined by Rockefeller's tactics, published a devastating, meticulous expose that revealed the secret rebates, the corporate espionage, and the systematic destruction of small businesses. The public was absolutely furious, viewing Standard Oil not as a great American triumph, but as a terrifying, multi-tentacled octopus wrapping itself around the throat of democracy itself. Politicians realized that public anger was a tidal wave they could ride, and the United States government launched a massive, multi-year legal assault against the company. The battle culminated in May of 1911, when the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly that must be forcefully broken apart into 34 independent companies. It was supposed to be the ultimate defeat for the world's richest man. The irony of the government's victory was absolute and complete, proving that the system Rockefeller built was far more powerful than the laws designed to stop it. When Standard Oil was broken apart into separate pieces, including companies that we know today as ExxonMobil and Chevron, Rockefeller still owned his proportional shares in every single one of them. As these newly independent companies began to compete and grow on their own, their combined stock value absolutely skyrocketed. Almost overnight, the forced breakup of his monopoly made Rockefeller twice as wealthy as he had been before the trial, cementing his status as the world's very first official billionaire. At the exact same time, a massive technological shift was occurring. Kerosene was becoming obsolete thanks to the invention of Thomas Edison's electric light bulb, a change that should have ruined an oil king. But right as the demand for lamp oil plummeted, the internal combustion engine arrived, and the world suddenly developed an insatiable, desperate hunger for a previously useless byproduct of the refining process called gasoline. Rockefeller's factories were perfectly positioned to fuel the 20th century. The ripple effects of his organization method shaped the modern corporate landscape. He pioneered the holding company and the trust, legal structures that allowed a small group of directors to control vast networks of industries from a centralized boardroom, a blueprint that every single modern tech giant and multinational conglomerate uses today. Later in life, facing intense public hatred and a fragile stomach that limited him to crackers and milk, Rockefeller shifted his terrifying efficiency toward charity. He applied the exact same corporate logic to giving away his fortune, establishing the Rockefeller Foundation and creating the modern system of structured philanthropy. He did not just hand out coins. He funded systemic scientific research, virtually eradicated hookworm in the American South, and built universities that transformed global medicine. His money helped create the world we inhabit, ensuring that whether you visit a hospital, drive a car, or turn on a computer, you are operating within an ecosystem shaped by his wealth. John D. Rockefeller lived to be 97 years old, passing away quietly in his sleep, having achieved every single material goal he set for himself as a penniless 16-year-old clerk. He died believing completely that his actions were entirely righteous, stating often that God had given him his money because he had saved an essential industry from self-destruction. The uncomfortable truth we must confront when looking at his life is that his brutal, monopolistic methods actually worked to stabilize a volatile world. He replaced chaos with predictable efficiency, brought cheap, reliable light to millions of homes, and created an industrial standard that fueled a global superpower. But he did it by proving that in the game of unbridled capitalism, the most logical, profitable destination is always absolute control. He left us with a haunting question that our society is still trying to answer over a century later. Can a nation remain truly free when its entire economic engine is driven by a system that naturally rewards the total elimination of competition? If Rockefeller were alive today, in our era of trillion-dollar tech empires, do you think he would be proud of how our modern world operates? Or would he think our current corporate giants are being far too soft? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let us discuss who the real modern equivalent of the oil king is today.